Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization Part 2. Today we are going to be looking at World War I. Our focus question is explain the factors that led to the outbreak of World War I. Why was World War I such a devastating war? The first thing that we need to come to terms with is some of the rivalries and hatreds in Europe at the turn of the 20th century. Perhaps the deepest and the most entrenched was the German-French rivalry. France had suffered a humiliating defeat at the hands of Germany in 1871. Germany had replaced France from its traditional role as the premier power in Europe as a result of defeating her. And to add insult to injury, the Germans had declared the German Empire in Versailles and also seized Alsace and Lorraine. All of this was a very bitter pill for the French to swallow, and they dreamed of getting revenge on the Germans. Another factor to consider is the growth of nationalism. The late 19th century saw the spread of both a pan-Germanic, pan meaning all, so an all-Germanic movement, a movement among Germans to get together. We saw that was critical in the founding of Germany, but had also spread into Austria and other German-speaking lands. At the same time, an even newer phenomena was the Pan-Slavic movement. The Slavs lived in a variety of different places to the east of Germany. Many Slavs did not have their own homeland, and some dreamed of a united Slavic empire. And oftentimes, Germanic and Slavic lands overlapped each other, so neither side could get exactly what they wanted. And as these movements continued to grow, they became more virulent and more hostile to each other. Increasingly, nationalism was becoming more and more exclusive. Perhaps the best example of this is the German song, which would soon become the national anthem, Deutschland über alles, or Deutschland, Germany, over all. The words of the song went like this: Deutschland, Deutschland, over everything, over every other land. When for freedom and for liberty, we together always stand. From the muse to the memel, from the adage to the band, Deutschland, Deutschland, before everything, before every other land. Now, this was probably a patriotic song for Germans, but as we can tell by some of the lyrics, this was pretty exclusive stuff, and other countries had similar songs, putting their own nation above all others. By the early 20th century, journalism was also fanning the flames of this. More and more people were capable of reading, and journalists increasingly were creating public opinion through their articles and their columns. Every time there was a perceived slight of the nation, journalists would often rally and urge politicians to rectify what they saw as a great injustice. Another factor was what became known as the Eastern Question. Throughout much of the early modern period, basically 1500 to around the French Revolution, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire as it was then called, was a massive power. It had spread into the Balkans during this period of time. But by the late 19th century, Turkey had been collapsing for some time. In other words, many of the peoples who lived in the Balkans, that part of Southeast Europe, many of these people were desirous of independence from the Turks. And many of these people were Slavic, okay? And Many of these nations, as they were trying to emerge from what they saw as Turkic or Ottoman oppression, looked to Russia. Russia was the biggest and the most powerful of the Slavic countries, and they looked to Russia as a protector. Other powers, though, were interested, namely Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary, the Austro-Hungarian Empire as it's sometimes called, had concerns about this. For one, Austria-Hungary hoped to expand at the expense of their old rival, the Ottomans. But they were also fearful that if some of these new nations looked to Russia, this would give Russia undue power in its own backyard. And they were fearful that these Slavic nations that were beginning to emerge would just be another tool for the Russians, who they felt were encroaching into the Balkans. And so you here in the East, you have another uncomfortable standoff, not all that dissimilar from what you have in the German-French standoff, two nations who both don't trust each other. Okay. Another complicating factor was the alliance system. After the Napoleonic Wars, many of the European powers had sought to work together. I'll quote one historian who put it this way. During the 40 years of peace after 1815, the great powers were afraid of revolution. During the 40 years of peace after 1871, that is, after the Franco-Prussian War, they were more afraid of one another. So early on, they were cooperative with each other, but after the Franco-Prussian War, many of these powers began to fear each other more than they feared revolution among their own people. The solution seemed to be to form alliances with other great powers. Perhaps the master of this was Otto von Bismarck, who said, quote, "All international politics reduces itself to this formula. Try to be a trois, or a three in French, as long as the world is governed by the unstable equilibrium of five great powers." And of course, the five great powers at the time were Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, Britain, and France. And so Bismarck understood as long as there were five great powers, as long as you could get in the club with three, and then you should be safe. You'd be in the majority, so to speak. Now, the biggest problem for the Germans, as Bismarck saw it, were the French. And so the number one goal of Otto von Bismarck was to isolate France and keep her isolated as much as possible. That way she wouldn't be able to take revenge on Germany. And in order to do this, he skillfully worked over some of the other powers. One of his creations was what's called the Three Emperors League. He managed to get Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia into an alliance. Three emperors. They all had emperors. And this was no easy feat, especially because the Austrians and the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians kind of didn't like each other. But Bismarck was such a crafty and manipulative person. He was able to get even these what would otherwise be hostile powers together. He was just that good a statesman. And so as long as Bismarck was around, Germany got what it wanted. It got its it could always stay in the majority as far as the alliance system went. However, in 1890, the new German emperor, young Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Prussia, or Germany, I should say, the Kaiser, dismissed Bismarck. Many people see this as a foolish move. Bismarck was a seasoned, old statesman and knew what he was doing, but the Kaiser was young and up and coming and thought he could do a better job. Increasingly, too, the Kaiser took an anti-Russian line, something Bismarck had been careful not to do. And so, the Kaiser drew increasingly close to Austria-Hungary, but alienated the Russians. And, to make up for it, he did court the Italians, but the Italians weren't really a great power at this point. And so he forged a new alliance system called the Triple Alliance, and that would include Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. So this is kind of different from what Bismarck did. Now, one of Bismarck's biggest fears, and you can see it here, was to be surrounded on both sides by enemies. So the last thing he wanted was Russia and France to possibly get together, or, another Eastern or Western power to get together, because then Germany would be stuck in the middle. And so as long as Bismarck was in power, he was skillful. He had kept friends with the British. He had kept friends with the Ottomans, the Russians, the Italians, and you can see him here doing his thing. And then there's this little female figure to the left that's supposed to be France. She has no friends. But with Bismarck out of the way and Russia being alienated, well, this drove the Russians into the arms of the French. And so they formed the Dual Alliance in 1894. Now, the Kaiser had thought, well, France is a republic. They're into, they'll never agree to an alliance with the Russians, but it had happened. Now, this is bad for the Germans, but it wasn't a disaster because, well, Britain still was uncommitted, and as long as Germany didn't have three powers against it, then maybe everything would be okay. But changes were afoot in Britain. England was in a state of relative decline in regards to some of the other powers. Not that it was declining in and of itself, it's just that other powers were getting stronger. Once it had been essentially the only industrial economy in the world. But in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it was overtaken by both Germany and the United States. Once it had been the only real colonial power in Europe. But now it was facing off against rivals all over the globe, as France and the United States and even Germany started to get into the colonial game, and of course the Russians as well. And the British always felt that as long as their navy was double the size of all other navies, then it could always be safe because it was an island and it would be able to protect its colonies, which was the source of its income. But even here, she now felt under threat. In the late 19th century, Germany began to enter into the colonial game. Many Germans saw Britain's decline as inevitable and that Germany would soon replace England as the #1 power in Europe. And Frederick Wilhelm, the new Kaiser, saw colonies and the navy as the key to prestige, that if Germany was ever going to become the great power, it was destined to be it would need a navy. And so he began to invest heavily in the navy. Now, the British perceived this as a massive threat to them. After all, they were a colonial power. Their protection was the ocean that had always protected them. And with the Germans growing, not only were they becoming an economic threat, not only were they a major military power, but if they could become a naval power, well, then there was no telling what could happen. And so many Britons felt very threatened by this. And they began to look at Germany as a threat for the first time. Britain and Germany had never really had a bad history together. Britain's rival had always been the French, but, with the rise of Germany, many Britons began to feel threatened. And so they ended their policy of isolation. For centuries, the British had tried to go their own way. Don't get involved in politics on the continent if you can help it. But the British felt vulnerable. And so they entered into an informal alliance called an Entente with France and Russia. And so this became known as the Triple Entente. And they entered into an alliance with, essentially was an alliance with two former rivals, but, this new alliance system was beginning to take effect. And so, as Europe entered into the 1910s, things seemed to go from one crisis to another. Tensions were rising. There were several crises in the early 20th century. There was one in Morocco between the French and the Germans, the Balkans, where Russia and Austria-Hungary were locked in a battle. This seemed to be particularly troublesome. There were a couple of incidences where war almost broke out, and it really seemed like the world was on the brink of war. And no great power wanted to back down. The public outcry at home, the journalists, it was really a tense situation. And so what we begin to see is the rise of militarism. Many countries began to spend increasing amounts of money on their military, modernizing their army, and began preparing for what they felt was an inevitability: war. And so the early years of the 1910s was very, very tense. And people were aware that all it would take was a spark to get things going. And that spark, of course, would happen in the Balkans. So many new nations had been created. One of the most nationalistic nations created, though, was Serbia. And Serbia had been under Ottoman oppression for centuries. And Serbia believed that they were entitled to additional lands. Some of the lands to the east of them, where there were Serbian majorities, had been claimed by Austria-Hungary. And this was particularly the case in an area of Austria-Hungary called Bosnia-Herzegovina. And the Serbs were convinced that this should be part of Serbia because many of the inhabitants here spoke Serbian. And in the rationale of the nationalists of the day, this meant that it should be part of Serbia. And so the region had a capital called Sarajevo. And though tensions were high, the Archduke, the man who was supposed to be heir to the Habsburg throne, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, went on a visit to this regional capital called Sarajevo. And while there, touring the city, his motorcade got stuck in a bit of a traffic jam. And a young Serbian patriot or terrorist, depending on how you look at it, took the opportunity and he assassinated the Archduke, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. Now, tensions had already been really, really high between Serbia and Austria-Hungary. And so with the assassination of the Archduke, well, Serbia gave an ultimatum, a very harsh ultimatum to the Serbs. They blamed the Serbs, even though the man who had assassinated him, it happened outside of Serbia. They blamed the Serbians for it. And the Serbians refused to back down. And so Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. However, because of the complicated alliance system of the time, when you declare war on Serbia, well, Serbia was allied to Russia. And so Russia attacked Austria-Hungary. They made it known they were going to go to war with Austria-Hungary. However, Austria-Hungary was allied with Germany, and so Germany couldn't just stand back, and then Germany had to declare war on Russia. But of course, Russia was allied with both France and Germany, and so this obligated both France and Germany to go to war against Austria, Hungary, and Germany. And so World War I had broken out. Okay. Well, we should say that initially people were pretty enthusiastic about this, believe it or not. Initially, on all sides, German, Brits, French, Russians, people were pretty enthusiastic. And this surprised some of the governments. They thought there'd be more resistance, but people were in a patriotic mood in 1914. For instance, 750,000 Brits volunteered for the army. There wasn't even a need for a draft initially. Many people saw this as a diversion from their boring lives, something exciting, a chance for adventure, a chance to take part in a great drama and fight for your country. These publics had been fed a steady diet of negativity about the other side, and so many people were really excited. And many people feared that if they didn't sign up now, they'd miss out on the whole thing, and it was going to be a short war most likely, and if you didn't sign up now, well, it would all be over for Christmas. And so this was in the summer of 1914. There were a few voices, though, who had a more sober estimate. And this was particularly the case with the British Foreign Secretary, a man by the name of Sir Edward Grey. He famously said, "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." In other words, Grey saw that what was unfolding wasn't just going to be another small conflict, but it was going to be something much, much worse. And it was going to change the world for the worse, at least in his lifetime, he thought. And as we'll see, he was closer to the truth. Well, the plan among the German foreign staff was the German general staff, the German army, was that they needed to be quick about things. And so they had drafted up something called the Schlieffen Plan. Germany was aware that it was facing the potential of war on two fronts. And this would be very difficult. You can imagine you'd have to split your forces to go fight in the east and the west. But the German war planners had reasoned that if they could quickly march into France, knock out the French really quickly, then they could swing around, fight the Russians, and that the British might not even get involved. This was called the Schlieffen Plan. Now, it was an ambitious plan, and it involved taking a shortcut. For this to work, speed was of the essence. It involved taking a shortcut through Belgium. Belgium was neutral, so technically, they weren't part of the war. But in order for this to work, they needed to move fast. And so Germany asked at first to go through Belgium. The Belgians said no, and then the Germans marched through anyways. Now, to the Germans' surprise, the Belgians actually put up a decent fight, decent enough to slow them down. And it gave the French time to prepare and see where the Germans were coming from, and also gave time for the British to get involved. And so this whole business about knocking the French out in enough time, well, this proved not to be the case. And both sides soon began digging in, and Germany was faced with what Bismarck had always feared: a war on the Western Front and a war on the Eastern Front. And so World War I began to take shape. Now, World War I was going to be a war unlike any war that had ever been fought before. And this is in part because weaponry had come a long way. We were now in the industrial age, and new developments, the second industrial revolution had already happened and was unfolding, and there were new inventions and basically improved ways to kill people. One of the biggest developments on the battlefield was the invention of the machine gun. Machine gun had been invented, had been developed in the late 1880s, and it enabled a defender to spew out 500 rounds a minute. That's like 500 shots a minute. So that's an incredible amount of lead to lay down. And it allowed one defender to mow down, a whole bunch of attackers. There were other fearsome weapons, though, too, like howitzers. These were big, powerful guns, some of which were capable of firing 500 millimeter or 20-inch shells. And when these would explode, people would not only die from the explosion, but they would also rain shrapnel all over the place. And so the howitzer actually accounted for about 60% of casualties on the battlefield. These things were massively devastating. And of course, another development was the advent of chemical weapons. This was the first war that really saw chemical weapons. And so both sides experimented with mustard gas, which would burn a victim's lungs and eyes and really incapacitate people. So these were some new fearsome weapons of war. Perhaps World War I is best known, though, for its trenches. The machine gun made frontal attacks almost suicidal. And so, to people's surprise, people thought this would be a quick war. It was actually just the opposite. These guns gave the defender a real advantage. And so the war quickly turned into a stalemate, with neither side being able to move much more than a few feet or, in some cases, inches. And especially in the Western Front, a long line stretching all the way from the Swiss Alps, the Swiss were neutral, but all the way from the Swiss Alps to the English Channel. And people dug in. It's estimated there were about 6,000 miles of trenches that were dug. Many of these were fortified with barbed wire, so it was really difficult to attack. And in between these trenches, which in some cases were only a couple of 100 feet away, there would be an area called no man's land. This was an area that, well, if you went into, you were almost certain to either get killed, shot, step on a mine, or get stuck in barbed wire and then get shot. So it became a very static war. It didn't move. And so these trenches that were dug provided some safety, but, well, they also had a tendency to fill up with water. And new problems emerged, like trench foot. If you have your feet in moist conditions and water for a long period of time, your skin actually begins to rot, and it's a very, very nasty condition that people became subject to. In addition to that, the trenches soon became filled with lice and with rats, and it really became a very, very miserable condition, not to mention boredom. You essentially signed up now to live partially underground in these horrendous conditions. World War II also saw new fronts open up, in the sense of the war being fought at new heights and new depths. It was really the first war to make widespread use of the airplane. The airplane had only been invented in 1903, 11 years before the war broke out. At first, the planes were used for reconnaissance, but people soon figured out that if you attached guns to them, you could shoot from the air. And very soon, something new was born, the dogfight, as two planes would go at each other in the sky. It also saw the first use of bombs. And so World War I was different in that way. Another new aspect of war was submarine warfare. Britain had planned to use its superior navy to starve Germany into submission. Okay, Germany relied on imports of food, and the British were aware of this, and one of their plans had been to try to starve Germany. They still had an advantage above water, and so they would use their navy to starve Germany. However, Germany began to make use of a new weapon, the submarine. And this was effective. They were almost impossible to detect. They would hit ships with a torpedo. And Britain found itself in a dicey situation because the Germans began to attack food imports to Britain. And so both sides were trying to starve each other out. And so the British began to resort to sending food and weapons on passenger ships, that is, non-military ships. The hope was that the Germans wouldn't attack something with civilians, but the Germans were aware of this, and so they began to prey on even civilian ships. And they get into a bit of trouble with this because in 1915, they sank a ship called the Lusitania. And on this ship, there were almost 1,200 civilians, including 128 Americans. And so this nearly brought the United States into the war. And it alarmed Germany enough that Germany began to pull back temporarily from submarine warfare. Well, with the war bogging down and no end in sight, going on well past Christmas, month after month, and then year after year, commanders were really slow to learn the power of these new weapons. There was a lot of pressure for them to break the stalemate. Politicians back home wanted something to happen. The public was getting restive. And so many of these commanders recklessly ordered their soldiers over the top. In other words, a mass attack of going out of the trenches and attacking enemy trenches. But this almost never worked, well, because machine gun fire would just slaughter oncoming attackers. And so battles like Verdun had casualties of 700,000. The Somme saw casualties of 1.1 million people. And these numbers began to shock contemporaries. Can you imagine battles where 1 million people die? And there were several of these. And so in World War I, the home front became incredibly important. As a matter of fact, this term, the home front, or the civilian aspect of the war, was really important. I mean, this is really the first war where all sides were involved in total warfare. And so many planners and many politicians realized that what was happening at home was just as important. Home was important because this is where food was produced. Without food, the soldiers wouldn't be fed and the war would grind to a halt, or munitions. And with much of the male population dead, wounded, or at war, for the first time, women began to enter the workforce in large numbers. They were needed to produce the weapons and run the factories that men no longer were working at. And so, for example, in Britain alone, 1 million women entered the workforce for the first time. And so this was a major social development. World War I also saw civilians targeted as part of the war effort. Prior to the war, the idea that you would attack a civilian was rejected by virtually all sides. This was just inconceivable. After all, Europeans were civilized. That was something that savages in other parts of the world did. But in World War I, as the war dragged on and as the death and the mayhem began to increase, well, civilians increasingly became a target. And it was easier now because, well, war was less personal. The airplane could bomb civilian buildings with impunity. And the savage conditions hardened people, and atrocities became more common. There were incidences of mass execution and mass rape, and things that would have just been unthinkable a few years earlier. And of course, propaganda was a big part of the war to keep the civilian population willing to continue. You can imagine the pressure as the casualties mounted, as the hardship mounted. It was important to keep the civilian morale up. And so wartime propaganda became an important aspect of the war. The key was to exaggerate the atrocities of the enemy. And if there weren't enough atrocities, to make up fictitious ones. And essentially to dehumanize the enemy, to make them so hideous and so horrendous that people would be afraid to do anything but fight. Likewise, it was also important to build morale and encourage people to continue to support the war and to continue to volunteer. Censorship. For decades, Britain had been moving in Britain and other places. Europe had been moving in the direction of a more open press, but censorship was practiced by all parties. Politicians were desperate to keep the true number of dead and the true conditions on the battlefield a secret. By 1917, though, all sides were becoming incredibly weary of this war. Millions and millions had died. The casualties, the hardship, the starvation. And by 1917, Russia had maybe suffered more than any nation. The war effort wasn't going good there. And the Germans were relentlessly pushing deeper and deeper into Russia. And so in 1917, the Russians revolted against the Tsar. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, in other words, leave his position, and Russia entered a state of civil war. And communist Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, came to power in this period. And the communists were not interested in continuing to prosecute the war. They saw it as just a bourgeois war. They wanted to consolidate their grip, and so they signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. March of 1918, they signed a treaty and ceded large chunks of territory to both Germany and Austria-Hungary. This was good naturally for Austria-Hungary, and especially since it freed up all of those soldiers who were fighting on the Eastern Front. They could now swing around, and begin to pummel the British and the French on the Western Front. But unfortunately for the Germans and Austrians, the U.S. entered the war in 1917. Unrestricted submarine warfare had finally taken its toll. The Germans had resorted to this again, and the U.S. began to prepare and send fresh manpower. And this was really bad for the Germans because the U.S. had a large population. They had a lot of industrial power. The Germans had hoped that maybe they could finish the war before the Americans came. They had a big push planned in 1918, but this faltered. And with U.S. help, the French and the British and Americans began to push in the opposite direction. The German lines began to crumble in the spring of 1918. The Germans were facing massive shortages in a lot of areas. The Austrians and the Hungarians were facing massive starvation. All sides were were absolutely exhausted, and strikes began to break out all across Germany as their lines were simultaneously collapsing. And finally, on November 9th, 1918, the Kaiser abdicated and a republic was declared. Shortly after, all parties got together, signed a permanent peace treaty, which became known as the Treaty of Versailles because it was held at Versailles. And on the 11th day of the 11th hour of the 11th month of 1918, the Great War, as it was then called, came to an end. Okay, so this is what I'd like you to do. I would like you to explain the factors that led to the outbreak of World War I. I would also like you to answer why World War I was such a devastating war. So grab a pen and paper and answer these questions. And I'll see you for a future lecture.